Hello, welcome to my channel, The Ascension Guide. I'm your guide, Joe Martin. Today we have a special guest who was set up through a friend, James Janko, who was on our podcast before talking about climate change and philosophy. And we have another interesting guest today, BJ Carpenter from the Archive. And I'll send it over to you and allow you to introduce yourself.
Hey man, yeah, thanks for having me on. So I was the co-host of the Archive. Things are changing around, rebranding's happened. I haven't posted any content for nearly a year now, but I'm sort of on that channel, going to be active again really soon, doing solo content. My co-host just moved to Colorado, and a lot of life changes have been happening. So anybody who follows me or Connor on the Archive, be on the lookout for new content. I'm really excited to be here. Awesome. It's revitalizing for my spirit. It's been a long time since I've done anything like this, so thank you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's good to have you. So for people who aren't familiar, could you just give them a brief what the Archive was, what you guys discussed, kind of tell who you are as far as or what kind of content you do put out or are planning to?
Yeah, so the Archive was like a gestational period in my life, I suppose, sort of like a cocoon. At the time, Connor had a podcast that he hosted himself called The Daily Discussion, and I just have a ton of ideas of things that I want to do. I'm writing a series of philosophy books. I'm building a system of spiritual self-help and development. I have a 5 to 10 year plan of building a spiritual retreat center and a semi-off-grid full-time living community and all these things. And so Connor and I, we became friends on the internet. He's from the same place that I'm from, but we actually never met in person until I had moved away. We just talked on the phone all the time, became really good friends. He ended up moving to the States specifically to do the podcast with me and to build a brand, and we started it, and it was really awesome. And it was sort of a blended thought baby between his concept of the daily discussion, which is any and all ideas should be challenged, even instantiated concepts of consensus reality. Everything should be questioned, and we should practice critical thought always. And that was sort of like his paradigm. That was almost like what he was, really focused on. And I brought to the table 2 major concepts in the Archive. One, the idea of the Archive being a representation of the great conversation, and that's the second piece. And so I'll speak about them in tandem. The great conversation is a concept that was written about by Mortimer J. Adler in a book series that he put together called The Great Books of the Western World. And it's essentially, long story short, just like a giant text series of 54 books, or 60, depending on which publication you purchased, that showcase from beginning to end in unabridged form some of the major works of the Western history, I suppose. It starts with the pre-Socratics, and then it goes all the way to Sigmund Freud. And there's politics, science, like Euclid and Archimedes, the Ptolemy, Isaac Newton is in there. There's just a bunch of really cool math and science texts in there. Then it covers philosophy and poetry and all of these things. Religious concepts like Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine is in there. So a bunch of people, a bunch of names. And if you study the set, you'll understand after 10 years of reading 15 pages a day, you will come to have a liberal arts education that will actually allow you to be sovereign as a free thinker in the Western world, because you will have had a fundamental understanding from beginning to end of the timeline that we're on, of how we have come to think the way that we do, and societal constructs are the way that they are historically and psychologically in all of the ways. And so he described this great conversation among these great men and women of history that we're all engaged in, that we're all having conversations in. And the more that people are influential, the more that their ideas are heard, the more that they go down in history, whether or not at different time periods in history they knew of each other. For instance, Plato fell off the face of the planet. Nobody even knew about Plato's writings for a long time, but people were still discussing things because of the nature of how the building blocks chronologically led to people's thought forms and mode of thinking. So even though they didn't know that Plato existed, people were still influenced by him. And then once people realized that he existed again, then people were able to have analytic discussions about his texts and philosophies, and people are taking part in this great conversation. So that's one aspect of the channel. And then wanting to fuel and further that great conversation through something called the Archive is just the idea that, almost like the Akashic record or Plato's theory of forms, just like the ideal reality where Metatron lives or what have you, if you're knowledgeable of these things. There's a place where all knowledge is encodified someplace in the cosmos. And the idea is to just like always be able to reach back and pull things forward to have discussions and participate in the great conversation. And then linking those two things was the whole concept of the union of opposites in the channel. So we always just wanted to take hyper partisan political concepts or even just like philosophical differences or religious differences, and through the spirit of one of my favorite philosophers, whose name is Ken Wilber, tried to like integrate opposites together to find a transcendent third, rather than just being like in the middle ground of any hot point topic. We were trying to find the transcendent third piece, which sort of is a middle point, but it's elsewhere on the grid. And then your line segment of polarity becomes a triangle and you can start to build. And so these are some of the major concepts of my channel. And then moving forward in life, just to wrap it up so I don't bore everybody just talking about the archive. That was a fusion between Connor and I. So there's a lot of give and take, and there was a lot of like compromise for what we were going to discuss and why and how. But now that I'm taking over and a lot of the content's going to be solo, there's going to be a ton more conversation about spirituality, metaphysics, the nature of reality, ethics, a lot of the concepts that I'll be publicizing. I cannot speak today. A lot of the concepts that I'm writing about and in the system that I mentioned will be talked about much more than what we have been doing. And then, of course, a ton of book reviews are to come. And most of the book reviews that I'm really interested in doing are books on metaphysics or occult Western like wisdom traditions and major world religions and things of that nature. So that's my background as far as the archive goes. So there you go.
Well, you just had like 14 questions pop into my head as I was going through. So first thing, since it's not a question, but you mentioned Plato, which is funny because I'm finishing The Republic right now, which is just a great piece. But the one thing that you mentioned that really stuck out to me was your spiritual retreat center. And I will tell you why, is because I have been tasked with building a building that is a self-sustaining retreat center myself, where it will be, it's a domed building where water runs underneath to produce a certain resonation throughout. It's got a glass ceiling with a triangle geometric geodesic shape. It has a giant quartz crystal in the center of this so that the sun and the moon can charge it as it goes over day and night.
I have a giant crystal in the other room. I should have grabbed it for this. It's huge. It's
really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. So it's no coincidence probably that we're speaking today.
we're probably going to get into it really soon, but just to throw it out, I had a major spiritual awakening experience about a year ago, which is what led to the pausing of the channel. And in that series of visions for a week-long psychosis episode while stone cold sober, I suppose, a lot was revealed to me as well. And I have some friends who are on the path. I've met acquaintances such as yourself, a lot of people with very similar visions. People in various communities have so many different words and jargon for it, like star seeds or, light workers or what have you, one of the 144 or whoever, the indigo children, whatever people have. But I just came to see that so much of us are all going to be connected and coming together for a very specific purpose and divine will execution, I suppose. And we all have very similar vision. So everything happens for a reason, man. And so I'm really glad to be here talking to you. Yeah. A huge aspect of what I'm about to be doing in the next year with my lover, whose participation in my life spurred the spiritual awakening experience. Her and I are going to be doing at least a year of full-time RV living to go up and down the coast. And as we do that, we'll be visiting off-grid living communities in order to gain skill sets and network and just understand how the economies would work and how exchange works and how people work and the logistics of it all. My sister has spent about a decade in Europe doing something called nonviolent communication, or NVC practice, which is a whole new, like in the last 60 years series of, it's like a lifestyle, I suppose. And it's a lot about spiritual awareness and communication and healing and meeting people's needs and gift exchange economy and all these things. But long story short, she's been traveling, living in off-grid communities for a long time, and she has a lot of skills and building them and understanding how they work. And I've been invited to a few spiritual centers that are completely not open to the public, that I'm really looking forward to visiting. And so in the next year to 5, hopefully, this vision will be a lot closer to fruition, and we'll have found people to buy into the vision and people who will want to invest, and we'll figure out how it's all going to work. So
Yeah, and that's a big key. And so, I mean, I've run into a few people so far that are, whatever you need, we're in, type of thing. So that's kind of cool that to run into. But it is interesting that, like, I met a lady one day at a I think it was like a Wiccan fair, and she was doing readings, and I was like, I know her name for some reason. I didn't know why. I just like her. I knew her name, and we sat down. And anyway, I didn't want to tell her anything, that I was connected or anything like that. I just wanted to see what she got. And after a while, she's like, "You're connected." She just started picking it all up, and then she started talking about this building, and I'm like, "I'm supposed to build this building." She had drawings of exactly this thing that the visions that I had seen and stuff. So it was really weird how people just end up finding each other like that. But you mentioned RV living, which my wife and I have been looking at RVs for the past several months now, thinking
awesome.
the same idea. So it's
Yeah.
it's interesting that a lot of people are getting these same messages or the same downloads, however you want to call it. But I did
Yeah.
want to go into your awakening a little bit more, as you talked about how, kind of what spurred it on, how it's been going for you. What have you figured out what your mission is specifically? You said your spiritual retreats, and it sounds like you have a pretty
Yeah.
good idea, but I know that every time I think I have a good idea of what I'm supposed to do, it's like 10 more things get added. And I'm like, I never even would have thought of that. So I'm curious if
Yeah.
it's similar for you.
So, not to give too many details of my personal life, I lived a long life in a very short period of time. I've been fortunate and blessed beyond what I deserve by God and the cosmos. Um, I've gone through a lot of different life experiences very rapidly, like literally lived on very many sides of the spectrum of what it means to be human in this paradigm. And I by the time I was 24 or 25 years old, I bought a house and it had $200,000 or $300,000 in equity already. And I had a bunch of paid off vehicles, and I was married, and we both had, lucrative careers, and we were both making really good money, and all of our needs were met, and life was really good. I met this girl when I was 16. We were together for a number of years. We separated for a few years, got back together, traveled, moved, got married, had a kid, and I just built this entire life, of which I felt was my duty to uphold and to do, but it did not fulfill my spiritual calling, this enormous calling that I've always known I was being ushered towards. Hence why I've been studying my whole life and doing the things that I've been doing. And when I finally decided to go ahead and purposefully destroy everything that I had built, while still taking care of the people that I love as best as I can, I dissolved my entire life purposefully. I had left my job at the very same time. I left my marriage. I left the house. I gave her everything because I'm the one leaving, right? I'm the one going to pursue my spiritual awakening, my path work, I suppose. And the moment that I did that, the moment that I decided to take action, something happened. Truly, it was the most psychedelic experience of my life. I got COVID the week that I moved out and was sick for 3 weeks. And during that time, I was quarantined in a white bedroom. I had just moved into a temporary living space that I was just going to be using for a month while I transitioned into to where I am now. And I got sick the second day of moving in. So all I had was a mattress with no bed frame. I had like a dresser and my laptop, like, and that's really in like a backpack. Like that's all that I had been able to move so far. And I was just ill in this white room, quarantining in this house that I was renting for a month by myself. And I had no energy to eat or anything. I would just DoorDash food once a day, just try to have one hot meal in me because there was no one to take care of me because of the decisions that I had made. And so I basically water fasted for like 3 weeks and hardly slept and had high grade fevers and all these things. As soon as COVID finished its role, the next week, it was a 10-day long experience. 3 days after the COVID symptoms left, I had an incredible, the only thing that I could call it was like an spur of the moment, accidental, spontaneous Kundalini awakening experience, to use some of the new age jargon that people would use. I'm talking like full on psychosis vibes for like 10 days, completely sober, in which I just began to understand the patterns that exist everywhere around me, and all of the knowledge that I have seemed to gain in my life, so much of the things that I've done unconsciously, all of the house numbers and street names and the meanings of names and titles and like experiences and phone numbers and friends and family and schools, and all of the patterns just began to speak to me, and I saw this threading between them, and it started to make sense, as though you were looking through a kaleidoscope, just trying to change the angle just right between the fragmented pieces of information to find a golden thread that leads to an actual cognitive space where conclusions can happen, and it in a clear and concise way. And after about 10 days, it finally subsided. But in those 10 days, I was given a blueprint of sorts to work out a system of spiritual work, of practice, born out of what I had already been thinking I was supposed to be doing with my life, times about a million in terms of the scope. And this awakening led me to a path work to study a lot of the Hieros Gamos, or the divine union between the masculine and feminine energies in the spirit. And I did a deep dive into a new age concept called twin flames. And this is a very, very new age concept that has surfaced in the last 20 years or so, which is a reskinning of ancient hermetic principles. And even Plato's Symposium, it includes some of these concepts. And I used to be a person to highly denigrate much of the new age spiritual movements. You know, I've studied all sorts of things. I've read Helena Blavatsky. I've read all sorts of believers in the perennial philosophy, and Rudolf Steiner, and like Eliphas Levi, and all of the, so many of the Western occultists. And I have, over the course of my life, begun to find disdain for and scorn for anything that I would deem as new age, anything that I would deem as reskinned thoughts, pushed by charlatans for their own personal gain or egoic gratification. And so, you know, for a long time, even if the concept is legit, I usually would pay I'd give no credence to anything. But this life-changing experience, which led me to this concept of twin flames, took me down a deep, deep rabbit hole of study and introspection, and then just getting downloads on downloads, which led to a system, again, that sort of is a mix between what I was already doing in my life, which was writing a series of 3 philosophy books, and becoming a wholly individuated self, which through one's own autonomy and vision and will actualization is able to meet a divine counterpart, either through love or otherwise, but usually through the force of love, and then to individuate together and to form a third beingness, of which also I'm called to build a community with others who are in this energy, as well as to teach the principles as I'm learning to incorporate them in my life to any and all peoples who would be willing to listen, because the principles are practical and can be applied anywhere. And it's not this like gate-kept sort of like master student energy. The thing that I want to build is quite open source. The Spiritual Retreat Center is quite open source. So, and then the archive plays a role in that. I want to have a library on site as well, where books and teachings and workshops can be held, and people can discuss these concepts, and almost have like an esoteric college of sorts also be part of the process. So that's where we're at, you know.
Exactly the vision that I have as well. It's you know, for healing, it's for enlightenment philosophy, which I tend to, the more I learn about philosophy and read different philosophy, I feel like it's mostly spiritual in a lot of ways anyway. But I, you know, it's funny because I've heard of people similar stories as you, where you're getting these, you know, awakenings within like a year and getting all these downloads that, like, I started back in 2012, 2013-ish. So I've kind of had like 10 years to kind of integrate. Like this past year has been a huge, you know, it was like this, and then it was, you know, going
Yeah,
off the
for
charts.
sure.
But it's interesting when I've talked to a couple people like yourself, where it's just been like almost, immediate, where you're just getting all this information and all this new stuff, where I can only imagine how that is to kind of flip your whole world that quickly. I kind of had a little bit of time to, you know, ease my way into certain things. And, there's
Sure.
been those flip upside down moments, but
It was more like, so like the first time that my awareness has ever stretched, I was 12 years old. I've talked about this on my podcast. I was 12 years old. I went and I watched a movie at my sister's house called Donnie Darko, and that it's a cult classic. Everyone knows what it is. And the same time, I also watched House of a Thousand Corpses that day. Just throwing it out there. Same day. It really touched me, and I went home and I talked to my mom, and I was like, "Mom, you know, my black sheep sister allowed me to watch this crazy show that probably should have been comprehended by a kid my age at that point, but I was blessed to be able to understand a lot of it." So I went to the library in search of answers about quantum mechanics and time travel, and like I was very interested in cognitive behavioral therapy and abnormal psychology and stuff like that because of Donnie at this point, and Frank the bunny. And so when I go to the library, I actually discovered a book called DMT, The Spirit Molecule, written by Dr. Rick Strassman. And I flipped through that book and absorbed it and took notes on it, and it just sparked up something inside of me. And I began practicing keeping dreaming logs and practicing lucid dreaming techniques. I began sifting on internet forums like Mictopia and Arrowid.org and the DMT Nexus and all of these places when I was very young, and learning about organic chemistry and altered states of consciousness. And the first time that I had a true ego death induced by a psychedelic substance, I was 15 years old. And from about 15 to 17, I really, really, really went very far into those realms with no guidance. And I was very fortunate to come out of it like a whole person still. But it definitely changed me fundamentally in the way that I see the world. And I've been gifted with just being able to, I've been gifted with aptitude, I suppose. So if I pick something up, I learn very quickly. I absorb information quickly. I pull things out of nowhere. It doesn't even make sense sometimes. I joke and say I learn by proximity just by sitting in here, and it just downloads and it just happens. But so it's like back then I had a lot of insights and a lot of questions, and I began to live in accordance with these principles that were made clear to me in those experiences at such a young age. But of course, we wake up and we go to sleep. And being a young adolescent male in the Western world with all of our social institutions and expectations and everything, I consciously decided to play a role and to be a participant in this process, and fell in love with the girl I felt, and did this whole thing and stopped caring about all the spiritual stuff. Well, then couple years later, I get back into studying. I'm getting back into reading and learning again, and I'm finding a passion there. And then when the spiritual awakening occurred a year ago, it was more like all of the floating islands of separated data points or like powerhouses that I had unconsciously accumulated, but was always part of the path in my life, all hyperlinked at the same time. It was like this giant thread work that just patched it all together. Like all the pieces were there. I've been collecting all of it and integrating all of it unconsciously. And then all of a sudden it all clicked into place, and I saw the whole picture in the network of how all of the nodes, separate nodes, would form ley lines of light energy, which would crystallize and form into these patterns of hyperspatial geometry in this metaphor of connecting lives and souls with other people and knowledge and passions and path work and light and all of these things. And it was just this incredible experience. And I finally understood, all right, this is what I'm supposed to do. Yep, here we go. But just because you have a blueprint does not necessarily mean that you know exactly what you're doing. And so I underwent the darkest night of my soul that I'm just now actually coming out of. I struggled very hard. I was unemployed for about 8, almost 9 months, living off of savings, off of money that I had gotten out of my divorce when I left. And I hermited up. I was living very closely with some of my best friends in the same household and literally one door over, and just choosing constantly to isolate and to not interact with people because of these tumultuous energies stirring about within me as I'm trying to understand the the weight and repercussions of the decisions that I have made to destroy my entire life, and the guilt and the weight of felt responsibility to pursue this path work, and falling in love with another woman who played an entire role in all of this happening, and understanding all of those things holistically was very challenging. And now I'm working on rebuilding, and here I am with you. And I've been putting pen to pad a lot. I have a lot written. Like I said, before the awakening occurred, I had already been working on a series of philosophy texts. A lot of that is written out, outlined. Some of it's fully fleshed out and written, ready to go. And then since the awakening experience, it sort of shifted and focused towards, again, this sort of individuation, like dual connectivity, leading into sort of like a communal togetherness of conscious awareness, open source vibes, which I'm like synthesizing together now, finally, and just trying to figure out how to do that to create this system of spiritual practice. And I have some friends who have had similar experiences. I have some friends who've had visions. I even have a close friend of mine who I would say is inflicted and plagued by a Messiah complex, truly, who believes himself to be the Messiah of the planet. Like truly, more power to him. And I love that guy, and he has a lot of knowledge and a lot of value to give. The last thing I'll say before I'll let you jump in, because I'm just speaking a lot at this point,
No,
is
it's very fascinating.
the final episode that I ever released on the archive. Funnily enough, I have about 8 or 9 episodes that we recorded. Some of them are edited. I just haven't released any of them. But the last episode that was published was the Messiah complex, all about it, how to deal with it. And little did I know at the time of posting that it would actually be a shining beacon for me to go back to and listen to multiple times during this year of going through this darkness. Because with that, it's almost like I unconsciously warned myself and gave myself a premonition or a prophecy about what was about to occur to me that would dissolve my whole life, stop the archive, stop me in my tracks, but empower me unlike any other experience in my life, but also like a warning to myself to not fall prey to my own egoic, selfish desires or visions of grandeur, of money and fame, or influence, or things of that nature, and to remember to continue to like be about love, and to be about humanity, and to be about just healing and growing. And so yeah, it was just all very intriguing how it all happened. And that's very high level, right? Because I'm not going into the details of things, but
Sure.
that's the high level. So that's what happened about a year ago. So
Yeah, that's awesome. It's, cool to hear everybody's different story. And, like you said, I talked to one guy, and it was like, he said it was just one moment, and all of a sudden he knew everything that he knew. And it was like, man, that must have been pretty intense, to kind of go through something like that. So it's interesting to kind of hear how people come to these consensus, because that's what I find really cool about all this, and has really given me a lot of validation with things that I've channeled, or things that I'll get a message, and then I'll make a video, and then 2 hours later I see someone in India giving the same message, and over in
right,
Canada or something like that, and it's like, okay, I'm not crazy here. And so
right,
I know we all kind of go through that. Are we crazy? Are we the only ones? Is this, is this happening to
right.
anybody else, type of thing? And it's scary. And it's so cool when you meet other people in the same realm, where you're like, okay, when I say certain words, they don't look at me funny, or, you kind
Yeah,
of
for
gauge
sure.
when you're, see where people are at. So and
Well,
more, I think it's becoming more, mainstream may not be the right word, but it's becoming more and more out there. I see more and more people talking about it.
so there's 2 things that I want to bring up. One is the book, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. I read that book a number of years ago. It changed my life. I've shared it with a number of people. I have a self-help section in the library I pull from. It's one of the books. And Joe Rogan ended up talking about it on his podcast. And I was incredibly happy, but also butthurt kind of, because I was like, I don't know, ego, I guess. But it's like, I wanted to be the first, but Joe is huge, and the book is very helpful, so I'm glad. But in the book, The War of Art, to spare you all the details, the point that I'm trying to make is just, people do not have ideas, or so is the hypothesis. We don't possess ideas. Ideas possess us. That human beings sometimes seem to be conduits for hyperspatial, multidimensional energies to flow through and manifest themselves and propagate. and we are just the channels for those things. And it is those people who are doing the work, those people who put in the work every day, who are developing their vessel and opening the doors and leaving them open, and to use a Masonic term, cutting the imperfect ashlar to the perfect ashlar, and constantly shaping ourselves and reshaping ourselves and redefining ourselves by vision and will. It is those people who seem to be graced by the touch of the muse more so than those who just wait for inspiration, or what Stephen Pressfield would call the differences between a professional and an amateur. It's just the people who do the work every day. And so it's good to see people like you doing the work. And then when you meet people in the world, such as myself, it's good because you're building that network and you're utilizing the tools that we have, which are always double-edged swords, the internet for one,
Sure.
to begin building this community and really starting to develop those connections of love and light, and trying to just spread the good word and touch people's souls. And that's really what I'm all about. And I'm very happy to have met you today, and I'm excited for where this conversation will go.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the the same thing that I've been getting with these, with this building, and you talk about this spiritual retreat center as a place where, like you touched on, and I think that's kind of the difference in the spiritual world, where some of the new age, like you said, is like this gatekeeper where people, I have this information, I am the master, you're the student, you can only, and I am the exact opposite. I'm surpass me, go be beyond me, I don't care, all the
Sure.
information I get is to pass along and to help in this process as much as possible. And it's the same thing where it's we're all getting these different messages, and I agree with that conduit sentiment, because I've always said that I believe, like, genius, for example, is just a frequency that people tap into, and I think that people are able to tap into this ever flowing, Jung called it the collective unconscious. Yeah.
I was just about to bring it up.
Yeah, so I think, well, synchronicity, there you go. But I think that that is where people are able to tap into that. And like you said, because when I do music, all I'm doing is translating. I hear it
flow.
here, and I'm letting it come through me, like it's
Just
coming
flow.
from somewhere else. Yeah.
Yep.
The book, when I channel, it's all the same stuff.
I get
It's
that.
like, yeah,
flow
so,
states. Flow states are always like, the greatest artists in the world will never take credit for their own work. It's always the muse. It's always the muse.
Yeah.
And or the Rain Man for the hip hop industry. I like to rap. I really love putting words together and flow and all the things. So I can appreciate that. Just like losing yourself into it. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the collective unconscious. It's something that we've talked about on the channel, and we connect it to certain concepts like Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance theory, which I don't necessarily want to get into too much here. People should just go look it up because I've said it enough times on the channel. But also, earlier I mentioned the Akasha, or the Akashic records, or Plato's theory of forms and ideas, and all of these concepts of things that exist in hyperspatial form, or in the higher dimensional space, that emanate and then flow downwards into this realm that everything is connected to all at once. As above, so below is one of the most overused, I guess, like platitudes of the West right now, but it is the truth. It is like the
Probably
number
misunderstood
one.
too.
Truly is, truly is. But you just bring up the collective unconscious, and so I do resonate with that. That so much of the time we're just all tapped into archetypal thought forms that are like archonic beingness, things that are larger than us, but that we're all connected to and play a role in upkeeping. And having humility and doing the work every day to be open enough to tap into those things is very important. A huge aspect of my study in the past few years has been on Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism.
Yeah.
And I had a rabbi, come onto the channel, and that was really cool. You guys, anybody listening, can check that out. But if you want to start to deep dive into things, most of the time I always give people like the Kabbalion. This actually, it's right here, this book, the Kabbalion. I throw this book at people as the very first starter book that a person should read if they want to sort of dive into some of these esoteric concepts of the Western occult wisdom traditions. And then the more that you study this, if it leads you whatever direction, personally, I went towards the tarot and reading and understanding the tarot and what it actually means and represents as a map of the cosmos rather than a tool that is misused to prophesy the future. Studying the tarot, I recognized all of the correspondences and patterns of encodified knowledge, and different schools of thought and philosophy across the ages have been encodified into it, thanks to some of the people who produced this book. And studying Kabbalah and in its original form is something that's very important to me. Kabbalah has 3 different spellings. One is with a K, one is with a C, and one is with a Q. And it's sort of like which group of charlatans stole the knowledge and which group is using it for their own ends. And I decided I really wanted to study traditional Kabbalah as much as I could, because I'm not a practicing Jew, I'm not Orthodox or anything like that. Despite apparently having some Ashkenazi blood inside of me, so that's pretty cool. But the whole point, I think, that I'm trying to make, why did I bring up Kabbalah? Something about
Akashic records and
the Akashic records, as above, so below. It's a very Kabbalistic principle, understanding that all of the realms. Yeah, I think I was going to talk about potentially the 4 worlds, or no. Pardes. The reason why I brought up Kabbalah, sorry, to just bring it back to home, Pardes, PRDS, because in Hebrew, there's all these intricacies and it's beautiful, and we could skip all the details for another day. But in the language, when you read the Bible or read the Torah, each line of text can be represented in 4 different ways, from a very literal sense, like what is happening in physical, tangible space, to a literary sense, like how does this work in terms of literary analytics. And then there's a metaphorical meaning, and the 4th is the sod, or the complete secret esoteric meaning that can't be conveyed with words or concepts. And these 4 meanings correlate to the name of God of the Tetragrammaton, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the 4 worlds, and how they understand the nature of reality to exist. And the whole point is Pardes, meaning the garden. Pardes means garden or orchard. There's a story, there's a Kabbalistic story. I believe it comes from the Bahir, the Sefer Bahir, or maybe it's in the Zohar, one of those. It's the Zohar, in which 4 rabbis together meditate and find themselves in front of God's palace, basically, like they go to heaven. And one of them dies, one of them goes apostate and like completely revokes his faith based on what he saw, and one of them completely loses their mind, like forever, psychobabble, crazy person. And one rabbi actually makes it through unscathed and is blessed with the knowledge and the knowing and the gnosis of what they came there to gain. And he returned back to the world and conveyed the information. But the whole reason why I bring this up, it's so long-winded just to get to the point, is it's good to, again, remain humble and open and leave those doors open to be a vessel, but not to grip too tightly on whatever is coming through, because you'll either perish or you'll go insane, or you just might feel so much fear and confusion that you'll cast it all away. And there's a rightfulness or a righteousness to the path of finding what people might call like Christ consciousness or what have you, but there's a way to it. And that's something that I've been trying to learn how to discern and have the wisdom to know the difference between, like this, that, and the third, the wisdom to know when is resistance the enemy, or when is resistance God challenging you, when is it time to stop, or when is it time to keep beating your head in the wall. And in terms of this spiritual practice, like having that discernment is very important. So the last year of my life has been devoted so much to gaining that wisdom and awareness, and then figuring out a way to translate it and then put it into practice and then share it. This is one aspect of the system. I call it the system, right? But
well, I think it's funny that you mentioned that. When is resistance you being tested, and when is it telling you to go the other way? So, just a quick story of, we were talking briefly before we started recording, that we were both in Sedona at similar times in Arizona. So when we got this message to go west and go help, so I'm in Pennsylvania, as we were driving, and we were about 100 miles about to go through Ohio. We were 100 miles from the border to Indiana from Ohio. our tire blew out and we were stuck on the side of the road for 8 hours on the center lane with traffic going either way. And, I'm sitting there and I'm like, did we make did I misinterpret something? Like, did I get did I read this message wrong? And, we're sitting there and it's like, I got the message of wherever you are is exactly where you're supposed to be.
Okay,
And
so beautiful. Yeah, continue and then I'll jump
well,
in.
I was just going to say that, and how you were saying with, how we turn that in a different direction is, I made a video about it and then it's in my book about overcoming that kind of adversity and then the lessons that came through it
Good.
of perseverance and not being kind of
That's so
and
funny.
what opened up after that, what was, I mean, and it sounds silly to the average person, but one of the sunsets that we saw, I mean, I would say it changed my life to some degree,
Yeah,
like just
they're
a sunset,
immaculate. Yeah.
yeah,
I
and it
climbed on the
was.
top of the Cathedral Rock, man.
Did
800
you?
feet in elevation. It was on the very top in the vortex, watching the sunset. I got pictures. They're on my Facebook. I'll link them to you. It's beautiful. It changed
Absolutely.
my life too, man. Energy is crazy. Well,
Yeah.
there's a few things that you just said that really strike me that I'll try to flow through quickly if I
Sure.
can chime in.
Take your time. Yeah.
So I call these things nugget drops. They're like golden nuggets. And what that means for me, as I've written about them, are when other people are conduits for the cosmos to speak words to you that they don't know that they're speaking because they have intended meaning, but they were led to use those words and convey messages that have all of a world of different meaning to you, sometimes full sentences.
Yeah.
And beyond just synchronicity, beyond just like, oh, I experienced that same thing, or oh, I know what you're talking about. It's like somehow the words that you're saying are literally conveying different messages based upon prior knowledge that I have or experiences that I have had, and you're touching on them accidentally. I call that a nugget drop. So
Okay. I like it.
you dropped a few pretty strong nuggets here. Just to highlight a few things, you said perseverance. You were talking about perseverance and knowing when to do that. The woman who is the object of all of my love, who's also my partner in this journey and my twin flame. She has a ritual practice that she's been doing that I've adopted the last while that I've known her. Is that every year she will come up with one or two key words that she'll pray on and meditate on, and they'll come to her. And those words are kind of like, rather than New Year's resolutions of I'm going to do something differently, they're words to meditate on for that year. And she doesn't necessarily know why they have come to her at this time, but they will. And then they always unfold it's just God and the cosmos showing her the way, opening doors. It's just a thing that she does that I've adopted. And this year, my words were victory and perseverance. And so it's just really funny that you're talking about perseverance here, and that you went to Sedona, a very similar time as me, were met with some adversity and learned to lean into it. And what you just said about things that are always happening to us are always meant for us is actually why when I was in Sedona, I got this tattoo on my wrist and it says surrender. It's hard to see, but it says surrender. Her and I got these matching tattoos, and they're made out of the ink that was used was derived out of the dirt from one of the 5 energy vortex centers. Yeah, when we went to the tattoo shop, they were like, pick which vortex dirt you want from the 5 centers. And we had this sort of like sacred union, Hieros Gamos-esque like vow ceremony to each other in the balanced masculine and feminine energy vortex, which is the only one of the 5 that is claimed to be this by the natives. And we ended up getting the dirt in our arms from that location. And surrender has been the entire theme that was unknown to me, although it's perseverance and victory. Surrender is the way out of the darkness in any situation in life, and that is definitely something that I have been learning this last year. And that's applicable in everything in life, but the first time that I ever recognized this truth and forgot, as we all wake up and go back to sleep, is when I was 15 and I had my first ever psychedelic experience of ego death with Salvia Divinorum for the first time. And learning how to surrender is the way out of all the darkness. And I would love to talk about that maybe at another time or even now briefly, but you just dropped like a bunch of stuff on me that really, really touched me. So I wanted to share a few of those details
Well,
of life.
I'll say you just returned the favor because surrender has also been my theme over this past year. And the lady I wrote the book with, every time I see her, she's like, surrender. That's your message. And just to let go
Surrender.
and not, yeah. And because
Yep.
I'm, it's interesting because I see how my path and why I was, like you said, how everything kind of adds up. And I've always been very logically minded, very like, you have to prove it to me type of thing. And then for me to come around and, and when I talk to other people and they're like, wow, really, you don't think like that. And so I think it makes it a little bit more believable, I guess, for some people when it's like, if you can come to that rational, and I know how to talk to people who are logically minded too, to make it make sense, combine the science and what you can, see, feel, touch, hear, and then how that plays to the other side. But yeah, surrender has been a huge, I'm so much like, I can't see how it's going to happen. So I need to try to, control and, figure out how it's going to all develop and all this stuff. And, I've been in a similar situation. Like I lost my job last August and,
Me too.
I'm sitting here.
Same month.
Really? Oh, Jesus.
Same month.
So, and the whole time I'm like, I'm not against working. I'm not a lazy person. I will work my ass off to do whatever I need to do. But they keep telling me, and I'm talking about my guides, specifically Ariah is my guardian angel that communicates with me. And they don't get a job. Just have faith. Just relax. Just surrender. Just do this. And I'm just like, dude, a year later, chill. And then somehow the money's there. Somehow it just, it's always
it comes.
That's
funny.
So it's just yesterday, that surrender and lay in the river.
Last night, lay in the river. So I go to the river constantly. When I was 14 years old, I read a book in high school. I read many texts. Shout outs to Mr. Kenny. He's on my Facebook page. Anybody can go find Ed Kenny. He's one of the most influential people in my life. Had me read a number of books, and one of them was Siddhartha, written by Hermann Hesse. And I don't know if you're familiar with the text. It's famous.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of it. I don't know what's about that.
It's basically about the Gautama Siddhartha Buddha, the very first Buddha ever. And it's written. Yeah. Hermann Hesse is a German, so it's like he wrote his own vision, his own iteration of what occurred. It's like historical fiction, right? It's not like complete reality. But the idea is that the guy was a Brahmin. He was a prince in one of the highest classes in India, and he decided to deviate from his path and destroy his entire life and to dissolve all of it for no reason other than his heart calling him to do so, and then finding his own way and becoming the Buddha. And the reason why I bring that book up is not to edify my own life path or tell anybody else to do exactly that, because I'll tell anyone listening it is the most difficult and dark path you can ever walk, but it is also the most rewarding if it's what you're being called to. But again, there's that discernment, like what is it that you're being called to? Don't just emulate someone that you hear or idolize or whatever. But the point of bringing the book up is the river. So when I was 14, I read it, end of the book, don't want to spoil things, but there's this cool river scene, something incredible happens. Something incredibly enlightening. And it's always stuck with me. And so I have a practice of going to rivers, shallow rivers. There's the Boise River running through this desert place here. And I live in the Treasure Valley. It's a desert all over the state. And we live in what's called the City of Trees. It's just because there's a lot of irrigation and water flowing. It's sort of like a little oasis in the desert. Shout outs to The Alchemist too. And I really like to jump into rivers and wade up into my chest, just to the degree that it can flow through my heart and my solar chakras. And I open myself and allow the river to remove any obstacles. It's sort of like a Lakshmi chant, if you would. It's like a meditation of giving away and cleansing, sort of like a self-baptism of sorts. And so I do it all the time. So you're like, oh, I just go to the river and I surrender. I'm like, that I did that yesterday. I did that the day before. It's a daily practice. So it's really funny that you say, let's go to the river. But yeah, it's wild.
Coincidences.
Yeah, man, it is. There's a lot going on. And then you said something else that I really wanted to speak on, but it's lost on me now. We were talking about surrender, psychedelic experiences, surrendering into them, the river, something. I don't remember at this point.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, it's been I don't know how much time you have, or I don't even know how long you've been talking.
Only about, I think, 30 minutes. I'm down to go for another 30, another 40.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Perfect.
We can do a long form is always good if your audience is down to listen, and why not? I'm just enjoying the conversation at this point.
I am too. It's been because I mean, for people who don't know, we've only spoken for about 5 minutes before this, so this is kind of an introduction for us too as well, and so we're kind of discovering these things. And like I said, when we introduced, James had mentioned that you and I would have an interesting conversation, which he was obviously spot on about. And so I had contacted you several months ago, and I don't even remember when, and we kind of just, our schedules never lined up, and then,
I was going through
I,
it is what
yeah,
was
yeah.
happening.
But as through that process, which was interesting, is like I was telling you earlier, we became friends on Facebook, and things would just catch my eye. Oh, that's an interesting quote or this, and then every time it was you. I was like, I got to talk to this
Appreciate
guy
that.
because, I felt like we were on kind of the same wavelength, and I think I've been proven right. So
I appreciate that.
yeah,
So often when I'm posting on Facebook, because it's the only social media platform I use, now that I'm going to be doing solo content, rebranding, and doing all the things, I'll probably be expanding a little bit more into the social spaces and just trying to network. But I just use Facebook for the most part. So anybody listening, if you want to have a conversation, add me there. BJ Carpenter at the Archive Owl, all one word. Easy ways to find me. But I usually use Facebook in the wall as just like a means of speaking to myself or dropping reminders to myself that are helpful. Oftentimes I'm criticizing myself in a very ambiguous way that no one would ever know that I'm yelling at myself. Oftentimes I'm wrestling with my own demons and I'm failing and losing the fight. And yet here I am posting. And there's something to be said about, living your own corpus, I suppose, or like, practicing what you preach. And I always do, but so often I use it as a place to dump thoughts to strengthen myself, and also to help others through the process. And so often I used to share much more technical things or things of not, real literature sources or concepts from my books. But now because I'm gearing up and getting more serious. I don't want to put ideas out prematurely. So I've since ceased doing that, and now it's just like a lot of that, just like posting thoughts and ideas and poems that I'll write or something. So I appreciate that you enjoyed the content, though. Truly.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's like I said, you can, at least now, I'm becoming much better at, picking up on people's frequency, so to speak. And there's certain keywords that people say where I'm like, okay, you have to be at least here to at least know that word or use it in the context you're using it, it's that type of thing. And and then when you start seeing a pattern, it was like, okay. But these conversations are fascinating because the interesting thread with the social, or the spiritual awakening, is that, like I said before, there's so many people getting information that is the same at the same
Mm,
time in different parts of
mhm.
the world without, and
Any
I'm not getting this I'm not getting it from YouTube. I'm
Sure,
getting it from
sure,
meditation. I'm getting it from channeling sessions or
right.
whatever. So, and the people are doing the same things and getting these same messages. It just helps to reinforce that all this is happening, and what's going on is real to a large extent.
So, like, I am a person who loves to play with ideas, even things that I don't necessarily buy into. I suspend judgment on a lot of things, and then I have, philosophical lines of reasoning super deep, and then I'll come back and just like be like, that was a fun thought experiment. Um, but one of the things that I guess earlier I mentioned Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance, as you talked about the collective unconscious, and I said I didn't want to talk about it because we've already been over it so many times on my channel, but I'll just say it now because you keep talking about it. And basically, long story short, it's an unproven, quote unquote, pseudoscientific theory or hypothesis, that's untested for the most part, that Rupert Sheldrake believes that if a subgroup of biological creatures who have sentience at some point in some place in space and time, some subset or subgroup, like if you have a group of rats in an experiment and they've never been exposed to any other rats ever, they've just born, bred, die in this facility, and you run them through series of trials for them to learn things. That he It's this concept that like all rats from now until the end of time will be more equipped, through some magical force or the morphic resonance patterning, to be able to handle those same scenarios quicker and quicker and quicker, even if they have to go through the same trials and tribulations to gain the knowledge. It's sort of like genetic memory, but without passing on the genes. It's like through hyperspace.
And that's
Um,
what, Darwin talked about in the Galapagos, right? With the, what was it? It was a bird or something out there,
the
or a turtle.
dodos, was the
It was
dirt,
something, yeah.
the birds. I don't remember the species of bird, but I think Darwin's black box talks about that.
Yeah. where
I
they were
don't know the
developing the same traits and then one of them was they were segregated on like islands, but they
exactly.
were developing at the same. So it's very interesting, and that's that same thread where
Yeah,
there has to be something more going on in this energetic field that we get so caught up in our five senses, and so many
yeah,
people are so distracted with their phones or TVs that they never
yeah.
quiet their
That's it.
minds and allow that information to come in and be open to what it is and ask what it is, because
Right.
that was one of the most transformative things for me is when I had a lady on my podcast at one time, and she was just like, anytime anything happens, ask who it is, ask why they're telling you,
Yeah,
ask all these
yeah.
questions, and then you start getting answers, and you're like,
Be
holy shit!
inquisitive.
Like I've had,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
oh no, no, sorry. No, you're good. Go for it.
I was just gonna say I've channeled quite a few different beings since then, and every time I get a different name or a different thing, and there's people like Sophocles. I didn't even know who
Right.
Sophocles was, and he came through and he's
Nice.
come through a few times to me and give me
Yeah,
messages. So
awesome.
it's
That's
been,
funny
yeah,
that you mentioned Sophocles though, because literally just 2 days ago, right before my friends were leaving, actually yesterday, it was literally yesterday, I went to the river with a new group of friends that I've never met before and made some new acquaintances and some really good people. Kid came over, and the reason why this book is out is because I was spreading knowledge and he was very inquisitive, just like you're talking about. And at some point yesterday, somebody said like the Oedipus complex or something. And he was confused and wanted to know about what was going on, and so I was explaining the plays of Sophocles and explaining all of these concepts to them of the Sphinx and the riddles and all of the things. And so it's funny that you
wow,
bring that up. It's crazy,
yeah,
man,
it
crazy.
is. Yeah,
And
Sophocles
again,
brought. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and again, I
Yeah.
remember now earlier what I was gonna say
Oh, cool.
with the whole surrender thing and everything you were saying, and your nugget dropping me on
Yeah.
stuff. Just last night, man, I couldn't sleep. I was getting all these downloads and all this like heart space cleansing of all this like negative energy that I've been going through recently. And today is like the first day that I feel like I can breathe, and it's all just synchronistic because here we are. Normally my energy is a lot more like uppity and happy, and I'm just like I'm a little tired. I've only had 2 hours of sleep. Last night was like a lot, and the whole point is yesterday I just like threw up a bunch of affirmations all over my room, which I've never done before. I just went and got some cards from downstairs, wrote a bunch of stuff on them, channeled feelings and thoughts, and I just like threw them up for me to just review later. And a lot of the things that you've been saying today are literally things that I wrote on these affirmation cards and put up, which is wild. But one
Yeah.
of them is ask and you shall receive. Just know that, earlier you said something that my beloved always says, which is like things do not happen to us, they happen for us. When we surrender, it's everything that comes to us, even if it's painful, is exactly where we belong. And if we can love ourselves unconditionally and really tap into the love of the universe and the love of God and the collective, even when we're met with resistance or pain or whatever, we can always surrender to the divinity of it and understand that it's for us in that moment. And if it's our time, it's our time, and if it's not, it's not. And we can love without attachment and let things go and let things in and let things flow, just like that the river meditation, just like letting it penetrate and take you, and just being a channel and a conduit for that divine love and the divine consciousness. And that that energy, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make right now, is you keep nugget dropping stuff, and that's the vision. And I wrote a bunch of stuff on my walls last night, and it's like coming full circle. So, and then the Sophocles thing,
Right.
which is wild.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too because James, I had mentioned Sophocles, which obviously it was multi-dimensional of who it was supposed to reach with the message, but he has in that, I think it's that same book set you were talking about. There's a book
The
that
great
has
books.
Sophocles on it, and
Yep,
he
yep.
he sent me a picture the one day, and I was like,
It's
oh,
like
that's
the
crazy.
third. It's like the third or the fourth book. I have a copy of it over here, but it's blocked by another book. I think it's like the fourth one in the set. Again, it depends on which publication, because there's like 5 different versions. There's like gray cloth ones, black cloth, faux leather. Like there's a bunch of different versions, and I have
Hmm.
almost every copy of every publication of that book set because
Oh wow.
it's very important to me. It's like
Yeah,
it's a wonderful
that's
book
cool.
set. Uh, Mortimer Adler, when he created it, he compiled it with a bunch of people and the Encyclopedia Britannica. He worked for the University of Chicago. He was like one of the chairmen of the board for the encyclopedia. And so they compiled this stuff together, but so much of it was his thought baby. And he created it to combat the Harvard Classics, because in the 30s the Harvard Classics were published and only given to the most elite of society and their families to become
Mm.
liberally educated. And so he felt like he wanted to do his part for the everyman to be able to become educated. Here, actually, just sitting on the floor is one of his books. It's the Sixth Grade Ideas, or Sixth Grade
Oh,
Ideas.
cool.
Mortimer Adler's written a bunch of his own books before.
I studied him a little bit in college, and I
Yeah.
minored in psychology, so he was kind of a fascinating
So
character.
that's Adler. That would be the psychologist, a different guy. That's
Oh, is it a
White.
different one?
Yeah, that's Alfred Adler. This is Mortimer J. Adler. So this guy, he was really popular and
Okay.
famous from the 40s to like the 70s or 80s. He was
Oh,
called
okay.
like the everyman's philosopher. Like
Oh, okay.
he was famous for taking concepts that were complex and complicated and then writing 110-page books to not necessarily give them as regurgitations, because he wanted people to do the work themselves. He helped people come to these things,
Mm.
and he wrote like 30 of his own books, and then he put that whole set together. And so all of his books, I almost own all of them, and they're downstairs in the case. And I'm planning on doing a lot of book reviews on them because they're amazing. And
Yeah,
I'll shoot you a couple of them, and maybe you can link them up or whatever. You could check out
absolutely.
some of them.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah. So the thing that I was going to say earlier, if you don't mind, sometimes I ramble and talk a lot right
You're
now,
good,
so
man. This is all good.
I'm sorry about that.
No, no.
Interject whenever. But earlier, when I was like, "Oh, I like to do thought experiments," sometimes it's funny, and we talked about the morphic resonance thing, and that could be an explanation for why everything's happening, or we're all tapped into the collective in whatever way that you'll call it. But sometimes I also wonder the advent of technology. There's a whole aspect of one of my books that I'm writing about the age of the machine and how all things are reflections of all other things, starting from first principles of metaphysics of the creation of reality to be understood as an infinite void leading into a unity singularity consciousness that by necessity had to separate itself in order to maintain its own integrity because of the metaphysical laws of how it all works. And then it falls into itself and creates more and more and more and more iterations of itself through a series of cascading mirrors and reflections and patterns. And we get all the way down here to where, we are just fingertips of God in that process. Every single thing that if you just turn and do a 360-degree rotation, every single thing that you see around you is an iteration of something in your spirit. And it is humanity. Nothing is natural around you. It's all alchemical transmutations of the space around us to fit our needs, to suit us, because light can only know like, and we just it's in the inside is the outside, and what you consume you put out. And so in the advent of technology, in the same way that we've constructed a chair to represent our need for sitting or rest, or we have created a calculator which symbolically represents our ability to compute, so on and so forth. We've created these machines that reflect us in the most intimate way that we have ever created any art form or any piece of machinery or tools or anything. And for the very first time in recorded human history, as far as we know at least, we have this like serious reflection happening. And I do believe that sometimes, at least I hypothesize that sometimes, so much of the rapid growth and development is happening either by purposeful manipulation of subgroups of people, or just a consequence of this new advent of this technology, in which truly things that are egregoric in nature, an egregore is like a hyperspatial conscious awareness that emerges out of a pattern of smaller subsets of itself. So like cells become conscious of themselves eventually, agents become conscious of themselves in higher forms. There's like these egregoric patterns everywhere, and humanity has an egregore. It's Adam Kadmon, like the primordial light being of man. And like these, and every cannabis plant has a cannabis spirit. Every oak tree has an oak spirit, and there are these Plato's ideal forms and concepts of how everything emanates downwards. And these machines are these new nuanced, like novel representations of aspects of our spirit that we've never tapped into before, but of which carries its own egregoric patterning as well, because as above, so below. And these egregoric patterns and their interplay with us is like a wrestling match with self. and it's leading to a lot of growth, but it's also leading to a lot of destruction, as the further that you climb on the tree of life towards heaven, the deeper the roots must go. It's like every time this new technology develops, every time you have a new medicine, every time that there's a new solution, you're creating exactly the same amount of demons and problems and sicknesses, or misuses or mischaracterizations or bastardizations, because resistance, the Satan energy, the enemy, the adversary always exists by necessity. Going back to that first principle of metaphysics, in which the one thing had to separate in order to maintain its own consistency. So in my book, I talk about some of these concepts, and I do the thought experiment and sort of give a lot more detail on what I think is happening with the advent of these technologies. But it's sort of just like a segue, fun, like bonus part of the book, because it has nothing to do. It might just be like a standalone essay, honestly, because it really has nothing to do with the actual like meat and bones of what those 3 books actually are. And I can explain a bit of what those will be, if you're at all interested. But
yeah, I mean, for sure. You said it's a series on philosophy.
yeah, the first one is metaphysics. It's just like sort of a lot of it is just regurgitation of things that are like in the Kabbalion and other works, physics books and history books and major world religious texts. It's just a sort of an amalgam regurgitation of metaphysical principles on the nature of reality, as well as epistemology, like how can conscious agents know anything. So it's sort of just like beingness, how things it can be, why reality is the way it is, sort of breaking down certain concepts of esoteric wisdom traditions and schools to explain this thing, the sacred number and sacred geometric patterning of the world, the number system of 0 to 10, from like Pythagoras and the Kabbalists and different people in similar eras talking about numbers and then thinking about things this way, and why it's developed into the way that we think about the nature of the world and the patterns, and the, you know, we have 10 fingers and things are tens, and how light can only know like, and reflect the patternings of the universe. That's sort of like all the first book. And then the second book is, if you follow through the first book and you actually buy into some of those metaphysical first principles, how do you apply them? And what is the ethics of the application? Like, how should we properly behave, and what should we be focused on, and how should we be utilizing our energies? And like, what is the right way and the wrong way? That's sort of like the second book, practical application. And then the third book, I always joke with everybody who knows about these texts already and say, like, the third book I can't write for another decade or two. It's it's basically like, given my own personal experience and talking to everyone else about their life experiences and seeing the consistent patterns, as well as certain people who I have sort of like preached to for years and years and years, my philosophy that people have like bought into and incorporated and inculcated into their own system of whatever their worldview is. Everybody seems to undergo very similar patterning of like developing neurotic tendencies, or finding themselves at very specific roadblocks or challenges. And so the third book is sort of like, if you buy into the first book, if you practice what I'm talking about in the second book, then you will probably, like, by necessity, because it's all a flow of a process, find yourself at these like crossroads, and these are the problems, and these are how you get past them. And so, you know, like, for instance, most of the time, this is an example. Most of the time, if people do LSD for the first time, a high dose of LSD, it's going to affect them profoundly. The first time somebody does bufo alvarius 5-MeO, it's going to affect them profoundly. The first time anybody has an ego death or near-death experience or whatever, most of the time it leads to one of a couple of options. I would bet my money that most of the time it leads to solipsism first, which is, if you're not familiar, solipsism is just the concept that all things are one mind, your mind, which the Kabbalah it does talk about in its own way, but like, you're the only verifiable substance, sort of like Descartes might say, like, I think therefore I am the only thing that really truly exists. I cannot verify the autonomy and agency of any other beingness or consciousness other than my own. So solipsism is a trap that a lot of people get mixed up, and that's where they find themselves in like the Messiah complex patterns, or thinking that they're the sole person to do the thing, or whatever. And then it leads most of the time to nihilism, one way or the other. And then that branches out, and it has a couple different ways to go. And it's just one example. So following that line of reasoning is like, if this, then this, and if that, then this, and like, how do you get through those challenges? And that's the third book. But I need more life experience, I think, to be able to do that accurately. But that's kind of the system of what I was focused on doing before the awakening. So
That's very cool. It reminds me of just what you're saying, that you need more life experience, when Plato talks about how the guardians shouldn't be engaging in dialectic until they're at least in their 30s, and because they don't have enough life experience to understand things, and so it's kind of interesting that you have that same like thought process in that regard.
the Kabbalists, to go back to the Jewish mystic stuff, they, in their tradition, Kabbalah means tradition. It means it also means reception. There's like a whole concept in the Kabbalistic teachings of like giving and receiving, and what it means to give and what it means to receive, and all these cool things. But the word also means tradition, which is why the Freemasons, just to quick segue, like stole so much of their knowledge, so much of it from Kabbalistic principles, because they're doing the same work that the Kabbalists are doing, but they're doing it free. They're building Solomon's temple, but they're doing it freely of their own volition, free of the tradition that yokes the Hebrews and the Israelites, and yokes the people by blood oath and blood magic, Theodevave, and all the things. So to throw it back to the Kabbalists, though, in their tradition, they will not usually teach the esoteric side of the Tanakh and the Torah and the Zohar and all the teachings until a person is 40. They must be 40. They have to be a Jew. They have to have been married and have had children. They basically had to have lived their life and consolidated some wealth, and then like built their household, and like had a bunch of sexual encounters, and just like lived life enough to the point where like they would be ready to sort of let go. And because it's like life happens in cycles, and there's archetypes, right? Like we try to meet our basic needs, and then as we're like in our 18 years to like mid 20s, we're trying to determine how to build our wealth, and we're finding ourselves and undertaking the hero's journey and taking risks. And then 28 to 30, like 34, is just like learning how to consolidate that wealth and ensure that it's not gonna be, you go through your midlife crisis and stuff around 35 to 45. And right around that time is when like the worldly shit doesn't fulfill you anymore, and you're ready to sort of like go of the pleasures of the world, and you realize like the development of the spirit is so much more valuable, and that's the point of coming to this world. And so they usually don't teach until 40, again because of the fear of the Pardes story of like you can lose your mind or die or go apostate unless you have the wisdom and discernment. And so, but there have been a few times in history for the Jews in which young men as young as like 15 years old were able and were gifted the ability to study, and were allowed to by the rabbis. And one such person's name was Isaac Luria, or the Ari, the lion, which is always funny because I'm a Leo, I'm the lion, and I'm always like, oh, I started my journey when I was super young too, but I didn't have like a cast of mystics to help guide me, unless it's like the Council of the White Brotherhood, like I didn't have any of that.
Yeah. And that's hopefully in the future what, it seems like our vision is kind of staying with this, sort of spiritual retreat, as you call it, or this building that I've been tasked with, is to allow people, if they want to learn these things, to, have this access where it's not this guardian gatekeeper, like, you can't do this type of thing. And I think that'll be very interesting to see, because I always, and, I kind of go back and forth, especially, like reading Plato and then talking to you, and, where there are these reasons why certain traditions you didn't do things until a certain age, or that you didn't, you're not, mature enough, maybe physically, mentally, all those, but spiritually are you mature enough? There's different, and like they talk about in different, like magic ceremony and stuff like that, where people have to be at a certain level of knowledge before they, because it can be very dangerous. Like you mentioned Solomon's temple, and I don't know if you read like the Lesser Keys of Solomon and stuff like that, but
I've got it, all the Goetia, all of it.
Yeah, so it can. You think you're in control, but maybe
you're not.
King Solomon himself even said, "Don't do this stuff," because it took control of him. And
he lost his kingdom. He was riddled. I mean, he was so wise until he wasn't. Just shout outs for anybody listening. If you do some research, do not, in my, like, this is just my opinion I'm espousing here, just me as an individual, don't practice ritual magic, because most of those grimoires are lies. They'll lead you to places that you don't. It's like somebody handed you a key fob and said, like, here's the key to the Jaguar, and then you go and you like turn the ignition and you realize like you're in a submarine deep under the sea now, and like and you're like, they lied. So just be really careful. But on that though, on the whole gatekeeping and wanting to spread the good word and wanting to help, I mean, that's something that I've wrestled with since I was 14 years old, since I was 13 or 12, since I started this journey. Because like I did wrestle with ego when I was younger, because no one was on my level, no adult, no kid, like no one. And being in a small town like I was, I didn't have a lot of exposure to different thinking, to different people, different perspectives. That's why Mr. Kenny, he was so influential on me at that time. But I did have to wrestle with this egoic arrogance at times. And I actually talk about it in the Messiah Complex episode, if you want to go check that out. But I've always wrestled, even since back then, with trying to tell people things that they are not able to receive yet. And there's a few things that I want to say on that. One, Jesus said, don't cast your pearls to the swine lest they rend them into the mud. The Bible also says, those with eyes to see and ears to hear will know, and those who don't won't. Like can only know like. You can never make a person do anything. You can only influence them and then show that, like, you can only plant a seed and then hand them the pail and then show them how to water it, but it's up to them to find the motivation to water it. And there's something to be said as well about the nature of the information age that we live in that I always sort of like feel bad about and denigrate. Double-edged sword, as above, so below, heaven and hell, stretch in the same way. The more voices that are out there, the more charlatans, the more people who actually have knowledge who have no interest in self-lionizing, but who have good intentions. People are still like, even if the intention is pure, the road to hell is paved with the good intentions. And sometimes when we try to help and we put it all out there, like there's such noise and clutter and no guidance, and there's no systematic fundamental process of mentorship anymore, because the whole Western paradigm right now in the postmodern age is a dissolution of boundaries and destroying old paradigms and getting rid of tradition, and just doing everything free flow, which has its place. But it's quite dangerous. And so I've always wrestled with, like, how much do you tell people or try to? How much do you put out? How much do you not? How much do you code it and encodify it in metaphors and degrade the splendor of the knowledge simply for the sake of creating symbols or metaphors that are, layers and layers and layers removed from the real content in order to reach people, to bring them through the system to get to the real knowledge. And that's, I guess, what my entire focus of my philosophy is trying to figure out how to lead people through the hall of mirrors in the funhouse to get to the exit. And it's a very delicate maneuvering.
So I just got to jump in, because James and I were just talking. We meet every Saturday and discuss similar threads. So when I just got to the part in the Republic where it was the simile of the cave, and I've heard that it's mostly referred to as the allegory of the cave, whatever.
Allegory,
I've heard the interpretation several different times, and until I read it myself, I have a totally different interpretation than anybody else does, at least as far as I understand. Mm-hmm. That is about spiritual awakening, as far as I'm concerned. The people who see the sun are the people like us who have seen the other side, who understand what we're trying to say. So what 100%. I think, to relate to what you were just saying, we can't talk to people in light language. We have to talk to them in shadows, because that's what they understand.
But shadows can never be the light.
Right, so. But the shadows do represent some truth.
They do.
So if we can present the truth in enough through the shadows so that the people who only understand shadows can see some truth, then that can lead them towards the light of the cave in our own way.
I used to feel that way, truly. I feel like all things hold a semblance of truth, right? And all things can be applicable. Nothing should be cast aside. Like, we should integrate all things. So I think that there's a semblance of truth always to any argument, really, or any prescription of behavior. But so to segue for a second, I'm building a tarot deck with my partner. It's like an oracle deck based on the twin flame stuff. But
that's awesome.
If you study tarot at all, traditionally, the suit of swords is all about the intellect and communication and thought forms and all sorts of stuff that's visionary or mental. The four worlds of Kabbalah, the four worlds of creation, are the Kabbalists, it's fire, air, water, earth, and the alchemical. Yeah, and it's just like what they mean, like what fire represents and what wind and intellect represents, so on and so forth. In studying the tarot and in building my own tarot deck, I have a concept called the moon room, which is different from the mirror room. The moon room in tarot, it's like the sun is the solar light body. It is letters of light, just like Hebrew is a representation of the real language, the real code that makes all things be in this sort of like matrix hologram thing that we exist in. And the sun is like direct knowledge of experience, and it's the Hermetic tradition calls this gnosis, not to be confused with Gnostic. Anything Gnostic, it's gnosis, Gnosis, and to come to know something through direct experience is gnosis. And the sun and the light body is a representation of gnosis. And then the moon being a reflection of that sun or degrading its light, which in the tree of life to the Kabbalists, there's God and all of the representations of God that's unknowable. And the light of God flows down into the first node called Keter, or the crown. And then it like zigzag patterns like the Kundalini snake uncoiling into the very root, or Malkuth, which is the kingdom of earth. And they describe the glory of God's unknowable light becoming more and more and more degraded as it comes down to become more and more and more known. And there's a systematic process of meditations to open the gates to come to more knowledge, and then open the gates to come to more knowledge, just like you're saying, sort of like you ride the shadows up. But something that I have come to feel in my heart is that things exist, things can overlap like a Venn diagram, but for the most part, things are pretty like, although everything exists on all levels of the structure of reality, as above, so below, things do run in their own realms and their own domains more often than they bleed over.
Oh yeah,
And
I agree with that.
that being said, it's like the shadows when we're under the moonlight and it's dark and you can see things, but there's so many shades and phantoms and ghosts and things that appear to be but aren't. In the space of the swords, where you're relying on intellect, you're relying on language, you're relying on a process of reduction. That's all language is. Letters that reduce the infinite down into little hammered squares that we can then use to fashion a bottom up system of reasoning, which normally isn't a great idea. I mean, we're human and it's why we're awesome, because we have language. But it's also the fact that we have audible language and the way that it correlates to understanding reality. It's already degraded. Like, for instance, when I'm looking at this book and I say, hey, here's this book, I have gnosis of this book, and I'm coming to understand it as it is, but the word book has nothing to do with it as it is at all. It's just an interpretation, and then it's a stripping and a reducing, and then I speak it, and then it has to travel to you, and hopefully the message doesn't get distorted that way. And then you have to take that message and then also rebuild it from the ground up with your own interpretation of those reductive processes. And so language, the moon, the swords, the intellect is a trap. And I don't know personally where the distinguishing line is between coming to know the light body and to come to just like come to see the sun with your own eyes, versus trying to explain what the sun is by spending all day long in the light of the moon and using shadows and shades to somehow metaphorically describe what this splendor is of the sunlight. Sometimes I don't know if it's actually possible. There's a really good book by William James called On the Varieties of the Religious Experience. And in it, he describes the dichotomy between having a religious experience yourself, the gnosis of it, and then trying to convey that and having to reduce it, to share it. And then when you do, you can only use symbol, you can only use metaphor, light can only know like. And so if a person hasn't seen, then they can only know what they have seen. So then you're degrading the light and degrading the light and reducing it and giving it to someone in a form that is no longer anything like what it actually is. And sometimes I don't know if it actually works. I mean, Some people say it does. I mean, symbolic sigil magic works that way, right? You just meditate on symbols that mean nothing to you, and then through the resonance pattern, you all of a sudden wake up. So maybe there's something to be said about spending time in the light of the moon, spending time in the intellect. I guess the whole point I'm trying to make, though, is I think that the best way to bring people to knowledge, although there is something to be said about discourse and words and metaphors and symbols, the real way is going to be making true changes in ourselves and our hearts after we've gained vision, and then we align our will with that vision and hold it always in laser focus, and allow our actions and our beingness to be that light. So that way, by proximity, we will be touching people. Just like you said, laying on hands. Just by proximity, people wake, because you are the light of the sun. You are that. And so, and like popcorn effect, the heat from your beingness will cause the next kernel to pop. And then all of a sudden, people are just getting it, more so than just speaking, or more so than just reading books. But there's a time and a place for it. It's just, I feel like we get lost in it. And that's part of the curse of the postmodern era we live in, where all of the words are being redefined and all of the concepts are being changed, and everyone's getting lost in language games instead of actually discussing the real thing. So that's all I have to say.
And I think that that's the same thread that I've said a few times in my channel and to different people. When someone refers to it as God or the creator or energy, or, we're all saying the same thing. People get caught up on the semantics of what we call it or what it is, but it's all referring to the same, idea, I think, overall. But that's where I struggle too, because there was a long time when I was on Facebook and I'm like posting stuff and resharing things and all these different things, trying to spark people's imagination to at least go, and I don't know if I did. I don't know if I accomplished any of that or if I just wasted my own time. And, so I stopped doing that because I came to that same conclusion that you had, basically, that. And I the way I think I interpret the speaking in shadows is that, there's times where we're saying something and you and I get it because we're on that same wavelength.
We have like terms. We defined our terms.
So, but we have to be able to say what we're saying in terms that somebody else understands.
That's so the degrading.
Right. And that's what's hard. And I agree with you that, and I wouldn't say I've given up on it. I've come to the point where you're either going to understand me at this point or you're not. And like you said, it's the vibration is going to make sense. And the way they've explained it to me, when I say they, I'm referring to spirit or whoever, but is I'm a candle that other unlit candles come to light up so they can go light other candles. And I think that's the way we should look at that.
It's funny that you say candle in the way that you do and have seen a vision of it. There's a Kabbalistic meditation on the candle. You should just like look it up, Google it. You'll find yourself like on one of the Kabbalah websites or something, and you can read about it. They have a whole metaphor of the levels of the flame closest to the wick and furthest from the wick and the candle and what it all means, and it might really touch you. So just meditation, Kabbalistic meditations on candles.
I'm curious because I've read and I've seen different shamanistic practices where they will take candles and they will hand it to the person that they're going to heal. And the person will rub the candle all over their body to get their energy on it. And then they'll burn the candle and they'll read, and it'll say exactly what's wrong with that person, whether it's emotional, whatever they need healed, it'll tell them exactly what they need to know based on their information. And I've heard other people, when I've mentioned this, that people can do that without the candle. You can just tap into that energetic field. And I can do, when I put my hands on people, I see all kinds of different stuff. Sometimes I see trauma. Sometimes I've seen the darkness. Sometimes I've seen, sometimes they tell me what the person needs to eat more or less of. Sometimes it's loved ones passing over messages.
The guy on House. You ever see that show back in the day? Maybe it wasn't House. I forget what it's called. It's like a show where a guy was like walking with a cane, and if you touch somebody, it's like a detective, you could like see their trauma.
Yeah, it's basically like that, and it's very interesting, because everybody's different too, so it's very unique when I do these. And I got the gift, I think September last year. Through
that's amazing. So last year in September, is when I recognized that each person. So I call this collective. You were talking about collectives, the soul family. Everybody's soul family, right? Everybody's connected to the source, like we all are. But there's layers and layers of separation, right? Like there's things that are closer to the Godhead than other things, right? Like
Right.
water is closer to liquids than solids, you know? So like, although everything's the same, there are degrees of
Absolutely.
separation.
Yeah.
And I do believe, you know, whether or not you think about it astrologically or some other way, there are certain people right now on this planet who belong to different groups spiritually,
Yep.
who belong to different collectives. And I feel as though, you know, the people who I determine to be soul fam are the people in my soul fam, although I recognize that there are other soul families.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you may be a part of this, honestly. I mean, we're just
I
connecting and
agree.
vibing so hard. And
Yeah.
in September, I realized whoever is in this collective soul fam all has at least one or two literal, like, it's so silly to call them powers, but it's like everybody is awakening to their own spiritual gifts. And
Yes.
it's pretty insane, honestly. Like it's like, it's literally like a comic series or something. Everybody's just waking up with superpowers, honestly.
Yeah. It's amazing. And the things that and like I said, in addition to, we'd mentioned earlier how every time we think we figure it out, it's like the whole nother chapter unfolds. That's like this new, mission of what this all entails.
Ever unfolding.
And so, I'd gotten this at first. I had channeled about the building and how we were supposed to build this place, like we'd kind of talked about. Then I got the healing from Jesus, the ability to do this. And then just the other day I did a meditation where, I don't know if you've ever encountered dragon energy. I didn't even know dragon energy existed
I've heard of it.
I've met 2 dragons now, and apparently I'm supposed to go to all these different places where the ley lines are. And so one of the things we learned on this trip, and I know you felt it and you were talking about earlier, is there's like the feminine energy, there's the masculine energy, these vortexes around the world. And then there's also the places where the ley lines go, where the ley lines cross and those sort of things. So what happens is we have a place like Sedona, which has positive energy, where it's good, it's what the earth needs. And then you take like Gettysburg, which is a battlefield where all this negative energy has been stored, where a ley line runs directly over the top of it. So now all this negative energy is being fed up into the ley lines and distributed. So what my mission is, that I've just come to learn over this past week, is and apparently that's what dragon energy does, is they're responsible for the ley lines. They're part of the angelic realm. And so it's just been interesting having all these, pieces come together. But and I don't know if you follow like Gaia at all, but there's a guy called Matthias de Stefano. And I just started watching. It was funny because one of his episodes said something about dragon. I was like, well, I guess I got to watch this. I just had that dragon myth and all these different things. And he was doing the exact same thing. He started down in like Argentina and down in South America, and was going all over the world doing these same meditations and opening up these portals and different things. And so now that's what I'm supposed to do, is as we go to heal people travel, like you said, in the RV, that's the same mission we've been getting, but also along the ways hitting these ley lines and going to these negative energy places and transmuting that love, or transmuting the energy into love, so that it opens up into positive, so that it can feed the ley lines properly. And so it's just, awesome. It's interesting that,
yeah, it's beautiful. When I was younger, I was called in my spirit to go to these energetic ley lines. The first place I want to go to in South America is Machu Picchu.
I've been tasked to go there, so maybe we'll go together.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, if you were in Sedona around the same time as me, got this ring in Sedona, got this tattoo.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go have an ayahuasca ceremony in Peru, and then go climb Machu Picchu right after, and integrate the experience through it. But yeah, I mean, that was an old vision of these ley lines. I haven't even thought about it in years until I want to go to Machu Picchu, but I remember learning about these energy patterns and grids. And when I was studying like Nikola Tesla when I was 15, 16, and looking into like Graham Hancock's work, and just talking about the Nate and everything back then. And I was really intrigued and interested in all of these things. I really honestly forgot about it until you just mentioned it. So I'm like, that's really interesting. Ley lines. Yeah, those things. Yeah, let's talk about those things.
So it's all about the, and that's what they kind of alluded to me, is that you go to the good ones, charge up, go transmute the bad ones, go back to the good ones to charge up, and then go transmute the bad ones, and kind of keep this process going, so that it's opening all this up for this ascension process that's going on.
Yeah, makes sense. And a lot of people may denigrate stuff like that, who don't understand or don't buy into the woo woo or
Right.
whatever
It's
have
hard
you.
to
But
talk about at times, I'll be honest with you, but I know that we're on the same page. So it's, kind
I
of,
mean, yeah, where I'm at is like I always suspend judgment. I was having a
yeah,
conversation about that yesterday. If it's something that it hasn't touched my spirit, I won't necessarily knock it as not existing, or even consensus reality, like the daily discussion. The whole point was even things that we think that we know should be critically analyzed. And
absolutely.
Mortimer Adler, in his work, he wrote a book called How to Read a Book. I highly recommend it to everyone. You can
Mm,
check it out on my channel. I go over it on a book review. Um, and in it, he talks about suspending judgment, and what that means and why, and when you should make judgments and when you shouldn't. And so oftentimes I just suspend judgment, and I hear and I'm open and I listen, um, because everyone's on their own path and their own journey, and everything is glorifying the one thing, whether or not things are wholly true or wholly false. I believe that
yeah.
there in my personal philosophy, there is a big T objective true reality that exists, and consciousness being one thing across the board, fragmenting and believing itself to be dreaming. Um, every semblance of what a person deems as true for them carries with it a subjective truth, and the interplay between objective reality and subjective reality is as complex and complicated as any other aspect of quantum mechanics. Like earlier when we were talking about two birds, particles existing in multiple places, all sorts of
Right.
concepts like that. Things are complicated. So it's all good if people do what they do, and if you know your truth and you continue to live that, and you're living a good life and you're spreading love and light and you're being your best self, I think it's all the same in the end. It doesn't matter if we're a little bit deluded, or if we have the truth right in our palms, or if it's fabrication or not. I think that there is something to be said about the importance of discovering the absolute truth, but I don't believe it is quite possible to do so ever as a finite, limited conscious agent anyway. It's like the Kabbalists have a meditation of always reaching for infinity, always reaching towards the light of God, but it's always going to be a step ahead of you. You'll never catch it, because
Yeah.
it's the infinite cannot be contained within the finite. And that
Right.
being said, it's like you said, every time that you get a download, every time that there's something that comes to you and you're like, all right, yep, let's go. I want to get to the destination. You're shown that there's more to the process. And one of the affirmations I wrote in my bedroom yesterday was, trust in the process. Remember that all life is process, that there's no such thing as a destination, that everything is
Mm,
constantly flowing and ebbing. And conclusions are like, placing attachment on outcomes is an egoic illusion. It's an illusory
mm,
trap.
yeah.
And it's all the process of unfolding. We're all performing the great work and building the philosopher's stone together. We're all transmuting what is, and there's no end. Um,
Yeah.
so, like, we just have to continue the process, man. Just do the process.
Well, I got this nugget for you, as you call them, about truth. That was a message I got not too long ago. So you might appreciate this. It says there is one objective truth. Our perceptions of that truth make up our reality.
Hmm. That's true. That is true. In this book, Six Great Ideas, that I showed you earlier, Mortimer Adler talks about the six like concepts of liberty and justice. So truth, goodness, beauty, right? That's Plato, like the true, the
Yeah.
good, the
Yeah.
beautiful. And then liberty, equality, and justice.
Mm,
And he goes all through it and talks all about it. But one of the very first chapters is on the nature of truth and what is true. Just because something is true for you, like he talks about different fallacies of thought, like when people are like, oh, that was true at one point but now it isn't, and whether or not that's even possible, because if something's true it just is.
right.
uh,
Interesting.
but then he also talks about like true for you versus true for me, and that's a fallacy. And I don't always agree with everything he says, right? But it's a good book to pick up and just like really dive into
Yeah.
if you want
Just
to think about certain things.
make it think from a different perspective, and that's what I think a lot of people fail to. It's one thing to be able to read something and entertain it, and then there's people who read something and then it becomes their own
Yeah.
thought.
Yep.
And we got to be
Yep.
careful that we can read something and
Right.
entertain a thought without it becoming our own all the time. And just
Suspend the
this,
judgment,
right.
positive or negative. Don't
Very
denigrate it.
precisely.
Don't just buy it. It's like suspending judgment until you have a mastery of a thing is his argument. So it's
Yeah.
like when in How to Read a Book, he gives a discussion, argument, I guess, a process of reading a book 3 times. Like the whole
Mm,
book is about, he wrote it in like the 40s, when the 50s, when the cassette tape was just coming out for like car radios and stuff.
yeah.
So like the advent of being able to drive and listen to an audiobook it was just happening when he wrote the book. And so the internet didn't exist, or indexes. You couldn't go to Amazon and read book reviews, you know? So if you're in the library and you're picking up a book, his book gives you techniques to skim properly and do like a cursory reading, to taste what it is that you're reading, to understand what it is very quickly, and then to get like a good gist of it in about 15 to 20 minutes. And then knowing and discerning whether or not it's something you want to really, really dive into, something you don't care about, something you want to read once and never again. And then he gives techniques for reading it just cover to cover the first time, really, really quickly, just as fast as you think. Don't stop, don't ponder, don't write, don't take notes. And then, because he believes it's better to read a book all the way through and only understand 50% of it than to read a book 35% of the way through and quit because you put too much effort into it and you went too slow. So once you get and once you get done with the first reading, if it's truly something you wish, you're like, this is a book I need to master, this is something I really want, then he gives all the techniques for the analytic reading and how to do that properly and how to dive into it. And one of the biggest things that he talks about is suspending the judgment unless you do the work to master the concepts, and then you can make a judgment. But so often, positive or negative, we're always judging. We're always casting that judgment before we have an opportunity to truly see things clearly. And that is why he put together that big book set of the great books, to give people the liberal arts education, to be liberated, to become inquisitive and critical thinkers, and to have a skill set to do that. So that's why I love him so much.
Well, man, it has been an amazing, I would love to go for another 4 hours, but I do have to run. It's been 2 hours, but I want to do this again for sure, whether we record or just talk or whatever, because we got so much. I feel like that there's we could go on forever, I think. So I have appreciated you coming on so much, and it's been awesome. Do you have any websites or anything that you'd like to leave? And we can, you can send them to me and we'll link them below too, or if there's anything that people can check you out.
Thanks, man. I have the website, except it's down right now. I just got the social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, and then the YouTube channel. So I'll link them all to you if you want to shut them on the video, and then we'll definitely get back together really soon. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, man. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you, man. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks. And see you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Till the next video. Love and light.